Good afternoon, everyone. How is everybody? Great. Yes, I see there's plenty of room left up front, so those of you in the back, if you want to move forward, you sure can. My name is Nicole Pesky, and I'm the Communications Director at the DOT. I'm super excited to be here this afternoon to introduce my friends and my colleagues from the DOT, Emily and Jody. So Jody has been with the DOT since 2011 and serving as the Audit Services Division Director for the past 4 years. She's worked on various audits relating to uniform guidance, which includes subrecipient monitoring, which I should have started out saying, that's this session. So if you were thinking you're in another session, you can feel free to go. Nobody will look at you, I promise. No, we might look at you, but. And then we also have Emily here. Emily has 10 years of experience with the department. Part of her role is reviewing single audit reports and completing and reviewing audits in accordance with 2 CFR 200, which is uniform guidance. Her expertise is in uniform guidance, particularly in Subpart E, cost principles, and Subpart F, audit requirements. So please help me welcome to the stage Jody and Emily.
Thanks, you guys. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the session on your subrecipient, What Next? Today we are going to talk about a variety of topics related to subrecipient monitoring of pass-through entities as specified in the uniform guidance, which is also referred to as 2 CFR 200. Included in these topics, we'll talk about subrecipient versus contractor, subaward requirements, indirect cost rates, allowable and reasonable costs, and then Emily will go through single audit requirements, management decisions, and remedies of noncompliance. So to start with, it's important to talk about what is a subrecipient. A subrecipient is a non-federal entity that receives a subaward from a pass-through entity to carry out a federal program. In simple terms, a subrecipient is an organization or entity that receives federal funding from another organization to carry out a specific task or activity outlined in a project or program. A pass-through entity is a non-federal entity that provides a subaward to a subrecipient to carry out that federal program. So when talking about subrecipients, it's important to understand the difference between a subrecipient and a contractor. The main difference between a subrecipient and a contractor is in the nature of the relationship and the level of independence that they have in carrying out their work. The North Dakota Department of Transportation uses a worksheet to determine if a relationship falls under a subrecipient or a contractor. For instance, subrecipients engage in substantive programmatic work, contributing to the design and implementation of a project or a program. A subrecipient typically has more independence in achieving shared, and they act more as a partnership. They often share responsibilities for programmatic outcomes, and they may assume some degree of risk. Funding for a subrecipient is usually provided through a grant or a cooperative agreement. So now that we've talked about some characteristics of a subrecipient, let's go through a little bit of a contractor. So a contractor will perform a specific task and deliver goods and services as outlined in a contract. A contractor may operate under more direct control and supervision than a subrecipient, which may result in the contractor assuming less risk. They're primarily responsible for delivering a specific good or service. In essence, a subrecipient is more of a collaborative partnership, and a contractor is more of like hired for a specific or common goal. So the North Dakota Department of Transportation has determined that you're a subrecipient. So now what? When the federal government passes through federal funds to support a program, you can expect them to also require monitoring requirements. You should expect the subaward, also known as a grant agreement, to include federal requirements. Included, you will likely find a pass-through entity is required to conduct an initial risk assessment to determine the level of monitoring that will be required. The risk assessment will evaluate factors such as financial stability, organizational capacity, and past performance. Pass-through entities are also required to complete an annual risk assessment. The written agreement should clearly define the subrecipient's responsibilities, scope of work, budget, and reporting requirements. The subrecipient can expect to maintain open and regular communication and stay informed about progress, challenges, and issues that may impact the project. The pass-through entity is required to monitor financial reporting to ensure proper use of funds, compliance, budgetary guidelines, and adherence to financial reporting requirements. The pass-through entity may be required to conduct site visits. This would be assessing operations, verifying progress, and addressing any concerns. The pass-through entity is required to regularly evaluate the performance of the subrecipient to ensure that it's meeting expectations that are required within the agreement. Record-keeping requirements of the subrecipient should be included in the subaward agreement. The pass-through entity is required to maintain records of all interactions, communications, and monitoring activities related to the subaward. When it comes to federal funding, it's really important to note that if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So it's very important to maintain proper documentation. The subrecipient may be required to submit regular progress reports, financial reports, and other documentation as outlined in the agreement. The pass-through entity will monitor the subrecipient to ensure issues are being addressed and resolved and that concerns are resolved promptly to prevent the disruption of the project. The pass-through entity must ensure that the subrecipient is complying with all relevant laws, regulations, or policies throughout the duration of the project. The pass-through entity and the subrecipient must establish clear exit strategies in the case the subrecipient is unable to fulfill their obligation or that the contract would need to be terminated. It's important to note that this is not an all-inclusive list, and there will likely be additional requirements based on the federal award. Something that goes hand in hand with subrecipients is often an indirect cost rate. So an indirect cost rate is a percentage of the total project expenses that covers shared and common costs that are not directly tied to a specific activity. It includes things like rent, utilities, and administrative salaries that benefit the whole organization and not just the one single program. An indirect cost rate helps allocate general costs across various projects, giving a fair way to share the overall expenses without attributing them directly to any one single task. Subrecipients should not use an indirect cost rate to generate revenue. This should really just be used to recover expenses in that agreement. If the subrecipient utilizes an indirect cost rate, it must be included in the subaward agreement. There's two options for establishing an indirect cost rate. The pass-through entity can negotiate the rate with the subrecipient. In this case, it often requires a audit of the subrecipient's financial statements. The other option would be to use the de minimis rate, which is currently 10%. However, it is in negotiation right now to increase it to 15%, but as of now, it has yet to pass. Again, it's important to note that if the subrecipient has a federally approved indirect cost rate, this rate must be accepted by not only the North Dakota Department of Transportation, but all pass-through entities. So if the rate is approved by the federal government, no one can negotiate that rate otherwise. All right, so then let's talk about some allowable costs. Allowable costs for subrecipients can vary depending on the specific terms of the agreement, funding source, and applicable regulations. Allowability refers to the degree to which the specific costs are considered acceptable and permissible under the terms and conditions of the grant. Some common allowable costs for subrecipients in grant or cooperative agreement scenarios would include costs directly related to the project, salaries and wages for staff directly working on the project, including fringe benefits, reasonable and necessary travel expenses directly related to the project, costs associated with the purchase, rental, or maintenance of the agreement or of the equipment directly needed for the project, costs for necessary materials and supplies directly used in the execution of the project, payment to subcontractors, which it's very important that you make sure that subcontracting is allowable within the federal agreement, expenses related to projects, specific communications such as postage and telephone, costs for training programs and education that are related to the project's goals, utility costs that are proportionate with the project, costs associated with renting and maintaining facilities used for the project, insurance costs directly related to the project, and then again, indirect cost rates. It's really important to make sure that you review your federal award to make sure that there's not any items that are outside of this or there's any specific terms or conditions. But then, as you maybe noticed, there's a common theme throughout all of them. Any allowable costs must be directly related to the program. So there's also reasonable costs. So first of all, it must be allowable, and then it must be considered reasonable. A reasonable cost for a subrecipient in the context of a grant or cooperative agreement refers to expenses that are considered sensible, justifiable, and appropriate in the framework of the specific project or program. These costs should align with the goals and objectives of the funded project and comply with applicable regulations and guidelines. So some examples of reasonable costs must be consistent with the subrecipient's established policies and procedures. Costs should reflect market prices for goods and services. Costs must be necessary to in performance of the project and be directly related to its success. Costs should be allocable to the project, meaning that they can be specifically identified with and benefit the project. Subrecipients are expected to exercise prudent judgment when incurring costs. Subrecipients should make efforts to use resources efficiently to avoid unnecessary duplication of costs. Costs must comply with applicable laws, regulations, and terms and conditions outlined in the grant agreement. Subrecipients should maintain thorough documentation supporting the costs. Costs should be in line with the budgetary guidelines specified in the grant agreement, and the subrecipient should obtain any necessary consent or approval required from the pass-through entity prior to incurring the costs. So again, it's very important to review your subaward agreement to make sure that you're familiar with the specific terms and conditions prior to incurring expenses. So now that we've talked about allowable and reasonable costs, I think it's important to also discuss unallowable costs. Unallowable costs are expenses that cannot be charged to a grant or cooperative agreement because they are deemed inappropriate, unallowable, and not directly related to the project's objectives. These costs may include costs related to entertainment and social activities, the purchase of alcoholic beverages, costs associated with lobbying, interest on borrowed capital finance charges, costs resulting from violations of laws and regulations, costs related to uncollectible debts or losses, contributions or donations unless they are specifically specified within your agreement, costs associated with the goods and services for personal use, and then charging a profit or fee on a grant or agreement unless it explicitly is authorized within the terms of the agreement. So again, any cost that is related, so an example is any cost that is directly related to an unallowable cost is also unallowable. So an example of this would be if you would go for a golf outing or some kind of an off-site event where there's alcohol served. So alcohol is unallowable, so therefore the transportation to that outing would also be an unallowable expense. So again, it's very important to review your subaward agreement just to make sure that you comply with the terms and conditions. All right, so when certain expenses are deemed unallowable or unallocable, meaning they don't comply with the terms and conditions of the funding agreement, then the pass-through entity may have to recover those funds where they would take them back, and this is often referred to as a clawback. Organizations receiving federal funds should be diligent in adhering to grant terms, regulations, and allowable principles to avoid the need to claw back and ensure responsible financial management. Regular communication with the funding agencies and proactive efforts to address any noncompliance will help prevent these situations from occurring. It's also important to know that there's no time limit for a federal clawback, and that if a cost would be deemed unallowable, then it could be any time frame that we could require them to be paid back. So now I'm going to turn it over to Emily Ulmen, and she's going to talk about single audits, and we can answer any questions after that.
Okay, so before we start talking about single audits, Jody just talked to everybody about what a subrecipient is, what a contractor is, what a pass-through entity is, so I'm going to take a little hand-raising poll. How many in here are subrecipients? Okay, so we got a few. Raise them high, otherwise they'll make people stand up. Okay, how many people in here would say they're contractors? Okay, that's always really confusing, so that's good. And how many people are from a pass-through entity? We've got DOT, we're pass-through, so sounds good. So when we talk about single audits, we'll talk about pass-through entity requirement or responsibilities and subrecipient responsibilities. Just wanted to kind of see what the audience looked like. So we'll go ahead and start out with what a single audit is. A single audit is a specialized audit which includes an audit of both an organization's financial statements as well as their compliance with federal award requirements. Currently, a subrecipient that expends $750,000 or more in federal awards during their fiscal year must have a single audit conducted. The expenditure of $750,000 is also referred to as the single audit threshold. So prior to the adoption of the uniform guidance, single audits were also referred to as A133 audits because they were required by OMB Circular A133. It's a very creative name. You may have heard that reference before, but with the uniform guidance passage, they're just referred to as single audits now. The single audit threshold has increased over the years. The Single Audit Act of 1996 set that threshold at $300,000. And in 2003, OMB increased it to $500,000. And the adoption of the uniform guidance raised that threshold to the current $750,000. There is currently a big push to raise that to $1 million. However, there's been no firm decision or effective date for that. The purpose of a single audit is to determine if a federal award recipient is compliant. I gotta make sure I stay on the mic here. Is compliant with federal requirements, and it's an important monitoring tool for any federal awards. A single audit is also intended to be a cost-effective audit for federal award recipients in that one audit is completed instead of multiple audits for individual programs. Okay, so now we'll talk about what's required in a single audit report. A single audit report is required to contain an independent auditor's report on the audit of the financial statements, including an auditor's opinion on the financial statements. A single audit report must also contain a schedule of expenditures of federal awards, or a CFA. The CFA must include the total federal awards expended during the subrecipient's fiscal year. It must also list the individual federal programs by the federal agency, the name of the pass-through entity for any funds received as a subrecipient, the total federal awards expended for each individual federal program, and the assistance listing number, or ALN. An independent auditor's report on internal control over financial reporting and a report on compliance for each major federal program is also required. These reports indicate all material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in internal control, as well as any instances of non-compliance with the uniform guidance. The single audit report must contain a schedule of findings and question costs. The schedule of findings and question costs generally contains a summary of the auditor's results. It identifies any major federal programs, including the names and the ALNs. And it also indicates the auditee's risk. The schedule of findings and question costs also identifies the findings related to internal controls over financial reporting, major programs and compliance, and findings related to federal awards. A summary schedule of prior audit findings is also required in a single audit report. So the summary schedule of prior audit findings indicates the status of all findings included in any prior single audits that have not yet been resolved. And then finally, a corrective action plan must be included in a single audit report. The corrective action plan is not prepared by the auditors, but is actually prepared by the subrecipient. The corrective action plan must address each audit finding for the current report, must provide the name of a contact person responsible for the corrective action and what the corrective action is planned and the anticipated completion date of that corrective action. Okay, so now we're going to go over the subrecipient's responsibilities in terms of the single audit. The subrecipient is responsible for engaging the auditor to complete the single audit, for preparing the necessary documentation for the audit, and for preparing and submitting the audit package to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. The subrecipient must submit the audit package to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse within the earlier of 30 days after the receipt of the auditor's report, or 9 months after the end of the audit period, which would be the end of the subrecipient's fiscal year. So as we just noted here, the uniform guidance clearly states that it's the subrecipient's responsibility to choose or engage the auditor to complete the single audit. Therefore, it falls on the subrecipient to ensure that the single audit is completed within the 9 months of the end of their fiscal year. So here's some other subrecipient responsibilities. Subrecipients are also required to permit the pass-through entity and the auditor to have access to records and financial statements as necessary. In addition, subrecipients should let their pass-through entities know what their federal expenditures will be and if they will be needing to have a single audit performed. And so here are some of the pass-through entity responsibilities. These are really important for subrecipients as well, so they know what to expect from their pass-through entity. Pass-through entities must ensure that any subrecipients that meet the single audit threshold have a single audit performed. Pass-through entities are required to review a single audit report and the associated findings. And pass-through entities must issue a management decision for any applicable audit findings pertaining only to the federal award provided to the subrecipient from the pass-through entity. So we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail. So that first responsibility of the pass-through entity was to ensure that any subrecipients that meet the single audit threshold have a single audit performed. One of the major keys to that is that the $750,000 threshold in the total federal funds. That's in total federal funds, which means any federal funds pass through any source. It could be NDDOT, it could be FEMA, Health and Human Services, or any other source. So I'm going to run through here how the DOT verifies the single audit threshold. However, this can vary with any with any different pass-through entities. So NDDOT utilizes a subrecipient self-certification. So we've created a form, which is up here on the screen, which we call the single audit certification. A subrecipient would fill this form out and check a box. Either they're subject to the single audit requirement, meaning they've expended that $750,000 in total federal funds, or they're exempt from the single audit requirements. So on the slide is actually just a section of the form. This is the section of the form for the subrecipient to fill out if they are subject to the single audit requirements. So in this case, the subrecipient is required to indicate the auditor who they've engaged to complete the single audit and the date of completion, a copy of the report, and the date it was uploaded to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse are also requested with this form. In the case that the audit has not yet been completed, the subrecipient must also provide documentation from the auditor who will be completing the single audit, which specifies the anticipated completion date. Okay, and on this slide is the section of our form for the subrecipient to fill out if they are exempt from the single audit requirements. Remember, it's the pass-through entity's responsibility to ensure that a subrecipient has a single audit if it's required. So in order to verify this, NDDOT requires the subrecipient to provide a listing of all their federal expenditures for the subrecipient's fiscal year. So this would include any federal funds passed through any other entities, as well as any federal funds that are from direct federal awards. Okay, so now we're going to go back to that second and third responsibility of the pass-through entity, to review a single audit report and the associated findings, and to issue a management decision for applicable audit findings pertaining only to the federal award provided to the subrecipient from the pass-through entity. And what that means is that as NDDOT, as the pass-through entity, is only required to issue a management decision on findings related to funds passed through NDDOT. So that brings us to management decisions. A management decision is the pass-through entity's written documentation of the adequacy of the auditee's proposed corrective actions to address the findings of a single audit. Pass-through entities must issue a management decision within 6 months of acceptance of the audit report by the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. The management decision must document the corrective action to be taken. That is how the subrecipient is responding to the finding and how they're correcting it. A timeline for completion of the corrective action also needs to be documented. The corrective action plan that's included and required with a single audit will really help with those two requirements. In addition, the reference numbers the auditor assigned to each audit finding in the single audit must be documented in the management decision. And last but not least, there's some time requirements that go along with this. The auditee must initiate and proceed with corrective action as rapidly as possible, and corrective action should begin no later than upon the receipt of the audit report. So this means that the subrecipient should be planning corrective action before the management decision is issued. The last topic I want to touch on is other remedies for noncompliance. Jody talked a little bit about the clawbacks earlier, which would be one example as a remedy for noncompliance. 2 CFR 200, Section 339, gives some additional examples of actions to be taken by a pass-through entity in the case that a subrecipient fails to comply with the uniform guidance. So this noncompliance could be found as a result of a single audit, or it could be from another source like subrecipient monitoring. But some examples of remedies for noncompliance include requiring additional oversight or monitoring, imposing additional reporting requirements, temporarily withholding payments, disallowing all or part of the cost of the activity that's not in compliance, suspending or terminating the federal award. It's important to remember that these actions that are listed in 2 CFR Part 200, Section 339 are not the only options available. There may be other remedies depending on the federal program, such as meeting specified corrective action or other goals. So that is our presentation. We're hoping to get lots of questions. So we'll open up for any questions. A question.
Question.
Okay.
Is it only reported on those that we have in the board, or is it anything that we contributed to a federal program? Where we might not be the subrecipient of that particular program.
So are you passing funds through then? So you can be a subrecipient and a pass-through at the same time. Sounds like that might be your case.
The example would be the DOT does the project and just has a city cost share.
Okay.
We aren't the subrecipient of that particular program, but we are contributing $1 million towards the DOT's goal of contributing, doing this $10 million thing. Does that have to show up in a CFO, or is it only those that are awarded to us directly?
So it's not just what's awarded to you directly. It would be anything passed through. So I'm trying to understand exactly the project in this case, but it sounds, is the money that you're contributing, is that federal funding that you've gotten and contributing to the project?
Local funds towards the federal DOT asset.
Okay. Okay, so I'm not sure if I totally understand, but in the case of a CFA, it would be just federal funds that you're worried about. It shouldn't be, if they weren't federal funds to begin with, then they would not be included. Hope that helps. Sometimes it's hard without the intricacies and knowing all the details. Any other questions? Yes.
I'll just add on to Gabe's
Oh,
point.
yes.
Our understanding is the city benefiting from that project would utilize the federal funds
Yep, that's what I would agree with that.
To the benefit of those funds.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't know if they should include like some bridge money that they received, but they said it didn't actually go into their bank account, like the DOT kind of made all the payments, so they said they didn't think they needed to you put it on their SEVA, and I agreed with that, but I wasn't really sure.
So, yeah, I think it's probably a good example of like that relationship, subrecipient versus contractor is probably part of it. But it sounds a lot like it's a DOT project that DOT is facilitating for a local entity. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, in that case, DOT would be responsible in making those decisions. So that funding would actually be on DOT's SEFA, not on yours. Any other questions? Any questions on allowability or indirect costs, anything? Might have a shorter session then. We're hoping for more. Oh, yes, sounds good.
Indirect cost for a local.
Can you describe the process for calculating an indirect cost for a local municipality or a county that might be running a transit program or receiving federal funds for something else?
So in general with transits, I guess I'm very familiar with like 5311, which is a little bit different. But the 5311, the rural transits, those ones generally don't have an indirect cost because everything is being recouped in the actual billing. So like things like rent and everything are actually billed directly because they're only doing the one program. It can, with other indirect costs, I don't know if you want to come up and add more too. But with indirect costs, it's really recouping those administrative costs that can't be directly billed to your federal project. So it wouldn't be something that could be billed directly to your transit, but it would be something that is still benefiting the transit. So it can't be included in your indirect costs. Can't be anything that is not at all associated with the project, but it has to be somehow benefiting it. It's just not directly associated with it. I don't know if that's the right, if that's.
Did I answer your
I
question?
don't, yeah.
I just want to make sure you had some questions.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, I didn't.
From a DOT perspective as the pass-through entity, you mentioned that we do some compliance monitoring. On top of that, is DOT allowed to do audits? And if so, why would they want to do an audit of those type of funds?
So, yep, anything that is passed through NDDOT could be audited. Essentially, anything that is given to a pass-through entity, any federal funds that are given to a pass-through entity, and then the pass-through entity then gives them to a subrecipient. The subrecipient needs to maintain the proper documentation and everything. The DOT would be on the hook in the case that the federal government came back and said you didn't do this correctly. So we do have the audit requirements, subpart F, have a lot of requirements for that. But the DOT would be able to do any type of audit with any federal funds that they pass through.
And that could be a part of the risk assessment too. If it's a higher risk, then we would probably fall under the auditing of it. But lower risks may not be required to be audited.
As a pass-through entity, if our subrecipient had a federally approved indirect cost rate, but they were willing to negotiate lower than that, is that permissible, or are they fixed at it? Example being like a university that could possibly do 3 research projects versus 1 with a lower indirect cost rate. They know that they're entitled to the higher cost rate that's approved, but they're willing to negotiate down. Is that a permissible activity?
Yeah, so the subrecipient can choose that. I would just be careful as a pass-through entity to try and negotiate that, because ultimately it's really in their court when it comes to that. So like the DOT would never, say, no, we're only going to allow you to use a lesser of the rate if it's federally approved, but the subrecipient can choose to do that. I just wouldn't put any pressure on them to require them to accept a lower rate.
It needs to come directly from the subrecipient. So we can't suggest that. They have to come to us and say, we'd like to do that. Yep. Well, that's our presentation. Jody and I have our cards here too, so if anybody has any questions, we can give you those, or you can come up and talk to us. We've got still a little time. That's all. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.